Before you know it, you can't talk about Islam in relation to the grooming gangs and rape gangs that we saw in Rochdale, in Rotherham. It's reinforcing it in law that you can't talk about it, and the chilling effect of that is considerable. What I think is interesting is that government generally has worked with the mainstream media to try and keep a lid on any civil unrest. This is the biggest criminal justice scandal of our time. You can't underestimate that.
Simon, why is Labour planning to introduce an official definition of Islamophobia?
I think the short answer is that it's about votes. I think they're trying to shore up support in the Muslim community. Though having said that, my experience is that there's not a great enthusiasm. People aren't clamouring in the Muslim community for a definition around Islamophobia. When I was an MP in Rochdale, which has a large Muslim population, people weren't regularly coming up to me from the Muslim community and saying, "Oh, can we have a definition of Islamophobia?" They weren't in the surgery raising it. I'd go to summer fetes and things, and the Muslim community weren't saying, "Oh, this is a crucial issue." So I think it's being driven by activist groups within the Muslim community who want this. It's not being driven by ordinary Muslim members of our communities. But nevertheless, I think Labour and Labour politicians see those activist groups as being crucially important to shoring up their support in those particular groups.
One of the people who has been pushing this, and I think was at the start of it, of course, is Wes Streeting. Maybe it has something to do with the fact that he's now in a very precarious position in his constituency. I mean, he only beat an Islamist candidate by a few hundred votes. So do you think that's, I mean, he's known for being what the Americans call a soapy Sam type politician, and maybe that was motivating him.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. And whilst you don't get, ordinary members of the Muslim community coming up to you, you do get localised groups. So in Rochdale, the Rochdale Council of Mosques were very forthright in telling me what they thought should be happening in government, or what I should talk about, or what I should stand up for. But that didn't really reflect the broader Muslim community. It was what they thought as a small group of individuals who were relatively extremist, I would argue, in terms of Islam and what they thought was important. So I'm sure that Wes Streeting is experiencing something similar in his constituency. And your point reinforces my point, which is this is very much about votes. Wes Streeting will be worried about losing his seat. I mean, there's no doubt about that, because so many Muslims make up his electorate. And that it's not just about Islamophobia. I mean, this is feeding through into a whole range of Labour government policies now, I think, and which I suspect we will explore. But yeah, that's a good illustration. Wes Streeting is a good illustration of why people at the top of Labour, now in the cabinet, are pushing this particular issue.
How is this new definition, I mean, how is it going to be imposed? Is it going to come about through primary legislation? Well, how are they going to impose it? And what will its kind of legal implications be, do you think?
Yeah, no, I'm not sure. I mean, effectively suggesting that it's some sort of hate crime to talk about Islam or Muslims in a particular way. And then, as we know, it comes down to definition, and then it comes down to interpretation by judges. And as we've seen on a whole range of different issues, activist judges can take a particular view. And I've thought about this. I mean, Joe Public, just not Muslim, just general members of the public, will be completely oblivious to this issue, Islamophobia, and how it might be policed at the moment, just as they were in terms of the whole transgender issue. It's sort of creeped up on people. I live in London now, but I go back to Birmingham, to Rochdale and other places. I have family there, and I'm up north on a regular basis. And you talk to people, in the family or in the pub and around about, and they will be completely unaware of a debate going on about Islamophobia, just as they were unaware of a debate 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago about transgender. But then it sort of creeps up on them. And the same will happen on this issue, just as it did on transgender. And then they're all thinking, well, what is this about? Of course we know what a woman is. Why does it need defining and everything else? That's why it was so puzzling to people, and still is in those communities, working class communities in the north. They just don't know what it's about. And this issue will be creeping up on them as well. So in 2, 3 years' time, 4 years' time, people will be arrested. If this gets to go ahead under a Labour government, people will be arrested. They'll be knocking on the door. People in those communities will have said something that's slightly askew or something, doesn't fit with this agenda, these issues, these ideas, and they're being prosecuted for it. I mean, that you can anticipate this happening. I mean, that's where we're going with this if we're not careful.
The very sneaky sort of aspect of all this is that it clearly is a blasphemy law in all but name, though this is obviously being strenuously denied by Dominic Grieve, who's acting as the sort of government's gimp on this. Angela Rayner appointed him to give it some sort of all-party cover. And so he's saying, of course, it's nothing to do with a new blasphemy law, but the way they're implement or going to implement it is to say that an attack on Islam as a religion is to be conflated with an attack on what they refer to as Muslimness, which is an incredibly clunky concept. Doesn't make sense. But that's how they're doing it, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, that's right. And Greaves is tasked with investigating this and coming up with a series of recommendations. So we don't currently know exactly what he's going to come up with. But it is a blasphemy law by any other name, and that's where this real concern. But we've already got creep in relation to this. Somebody was prosecuted for setting fire to a copy of the Quran. We've got the Batley Grammar School teacher who has had to go into hiding for several years now because he dared to show an image of Muhammad, and on it goes. And this is just it's a progression, isn't it? And progression suggests it's positive, but it's a move in the wrong direction in my view, and it dampens any discussion on these issues. And then that's when it becomes really serious and a real problem for wider society and communities, because all of a sudden we're on this trajectory, we're taking this particular route which the Labour government are now pushing, and then before you know it, you can't talk about, for example, Islam in relation to the grooming gangs and rape gangs that we saw in Rochdale, in Rotherham, and in many other towns and cities. It's reinforcing it in law that you can't talk about it, and the chilling effect of that is considerable.
It's two-tier speech, I guess. I mean, it's a part and parcel of the way in which I think the contemporary left are wanting to move us away from the sort of politics of the modern era, when we're all accorded the same rights as individuals, subject to the same laws and obligations, and they're transitioning us to a new type of society whereby we are first and foremost members of groups that then have to be managed by the state, and that by definition means you have to control what groups can say about each other. That seems to me part and parcel of this. I don't know if you agree.
Well, I think it's a really interesting analysis, and the concept that you're describing is quite new to me, but I can see the logic in what you're saying. I mean, this is about policing people's thoughts and opinions. There's no doubt about that. And you you either fit in with them or you don't, and if you don't, then you've got a problem. And and it encapsulates a lot of what you get from Keir Starmer as leader of the Labour Party. Really, it's easy to describe him as not having any ideology or any conviction or any vision. But I suppose if he does have any vision, it's this internationalist view, this particular, I call it, he's this North London Labour view of what the world and what the country should be like, and what you were describing fits into that. He thinks, we shouldn't talk in a particular way about Muslims or Islam. He thinks we should kneel to Black Lives Matter as he does. He thinks we should take a particular view of how society should operate, but it doesn't really equate with where I come from. That's for sure. It doesn't equate, or it doesn't suit people from the communities I belong to.
I would draw the analogy, which is going to sound maybe shrill, but who cares? With the sort of 1930s fascist idea of moving away from parliamentary democracy and competition between political parties and groups of people who have different interests and ideas to a society which is organized along the lines of groups, or what the fascists called corporations and guilds. And it seems to me there's a direct parallel between the politics of the New Left and that view of politics, which is essentially a very elitist top-down one, but which I think, as you say, Keir Starmer that's part of his mindset, that's part of his political DNA.
Yeah, no, I think it is. And you've just reminded me, I wrote a piece for the Daily Telegraph, must be, time flies, doesn't it? But it must have been around 2014, something like that, so well over 10 years ago, where I described how, and this is no surprise, how politics from left and right goes full circle to the point where they nearly end up meeting again in terms of their extremes. And this sort of illustrates that. And the sky fell in on me when I wrote this. I was a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party. I was a Labour MP. And I think Ian Lavery, who's still an Labour MP on the left, was very critical, said it was outrageous that I was suggesting people on the left of the Parliamentary Labour Party were nearly fascist or something. But there are similarities. That's the truth of it. And I think, this is interesting in terms of Keir Starmer's rise in politics. We don't really know him. Most leaders we know because they've been around for a fair bit of time, but he sort of he was parachuted into Parliament and then parachuted into the leadership role with very little competition. And then he becomes Prime Minister. He's parachuted into number 10 Downing Street because there's very little competition. And only now we're beginning to learn what his politics are about. And I think they are quite authoritarian. I don't say that lightly. All the indications are that he is quite authoritarian, actually.
Yeah, I would agree. I think he's profoundly sinister, though he doesn't come across as sinister. One indication, I think, of what you're saying was when he was asked, did he prefer Davos summits to debates in Parliament? And he said quite brazenly, and I suppose this is because he isn't naturally a politician, so he was just giving actually an instinctive, honest answer. He said, Davos summit. Well, that's a pretty extraordinary thing for the Prime Minister of a country to say. I mean, he's meant to be the head of the parliamentary system, the whole legacy of, the Civil War where Parliament asserted itself over the monarch. And yet here we have a Prime Minister who's essentially saying something not dissimilar from Charles I.
Yeah, he isn't a parliamentarian, is he? And you were intimating this earlier in the conversation. He doesn't like Parliament or how it operates. I think that's abundantly clear. And so he likes to manage politics in the way that he sees fit. Lord Hermer as the Attorney General and how he's enabled to manage politics, and all this comes out. I mean, you can see it if you study or read around these issues. It's quite apparent, really, that's what's going on. And then there are some illustrative points, and perhaps Lucy Connolly, who's been put in prison for a silly tweet. I mean, and whether Lord Hermer played a role in that and things, and how they're trying to quash dissent, and how they're trying to bypass Parliament and manage all this, I think is significant, actually, and is going to become increasingly significant as this Parliament goes on.
Yeah, I mean, talking of Lucy Connolly, I mean, there is an interesting disparity, is there not, in the way she has been treated compared to, say, what's his name, Bob Villan at Glastonbury, who I don't think has yet been interviewed by the police, let alone prosecuted. Now, there's a separate sidebar discussion to be had about free speech, and I respect his right to free speech, much as I found what he said appalling. But nevertheless, given that the British state doesn't really believe in free speech, especially under this government, it is extraordinary that Lucy Connolly has been treated in this particular way, sent to prison for a ridiculous period of time, and yet he hasn't even been interviewed.
Yeah, no, I am totally convinced there's a two-tier justice system. The whole issue around Lucy Connolly illustrates how Keir Starmer is fixated with control. And some of that was about quashing the riots that came out of the Southport murders, and keeping a lid on any uprising that there might be in the country, and Lucy Connolly is part of that equation. And remember, just going back, we weren't that aware. I was saying we weren't that aware of Keir Starmer. But if you recall, during the pandemic, if we thought Boris Johnson was being draconian in terms of applying these rules and regulations on what we could and couldn't do during COVID, Keir Starmer wanted to go further. Of course, he wanted to go much further than Boris. So we perhaps did have a little bit of a flavour as to what he would be like, and it's proven to be true. He's very authoritarian, very controlling. It's a real worry.
Going back to this issue of an official state definition of Islamophobia, which is itself a sort of chilling sounding thing. I mean, why is the state imposing an official definition of anything? Political parties can be free to adopt whatever definitions they want to of anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. But for the state to say, this is going to be what all of you out there must think and comply with, is extraordinary. And it seems to me that what they're doing is weaponizing religion, which is a very dangerous thing to see. I mean, we've seen it in the context, obviously, of Northern Ireland and parts of Scotland, and it's an incendiary mix. But they're kind of reviving religious politics in order to galvanize a section of the community, are they not?
Yes, I think they are, and surely they must be aware of where this is leading if they're not careful. There's already, people are already upset in terms of the two-tier system of justice, which people can see for themselves. They're already upset in terms of how some particular groups they believe are treated differently to themselves. They're extremely upset about immigration. And then to have this added into the mix, where it looks like Christianity and Christian religions can have done to them whatever they want. So setting fire to if you set fire to a Bible, I can't believe anybody.
Dawkins, if he went outside Westminster Abbey, yeah, nobody would say.
Nobody would really care, would they?
Yeah.
And this is the double standard that people see. And as that becomes more apparent, that's what I'm saying. This is going to creep up on the public. As it becomes more apparent, people are going to get more upset. But surely Starmer and others can see that. They can't police the way out of this or into it, can they?
And what do they think is going to be the repercussion in terms of the non-Muslim community? I mean, even if we assume that the vast majority of Muslims support this, which we don't actually know, as you said. I mean, this is being driven by elites within the Muslim community who don't necessarily speak, obviously, for all Muslims. What do they think is going to be the electoral repercussion of this for the type of non-Muslim voters in places like Rochdale? I mean, tell me what you think, how it will go down once these people realise that we have a new blasphemy law.
Yeah, I think it's already breaking down. They have a small, Labour now have a small core of support, which I suspect is older people who are perhaps not on Twitter and social media and things, that don't do very much of it, and have always voted Labour. But that core vote is reducing all the time, because it's an older vote, it turns out to vote, and they always sort of vote Labour. That used to be a much bigger group under, in Tony Blair's day, and they could rely on it much more heavily than they do now. But it's really broken down. It's become increasingly small because people aren't happy with Labour's inability to define a woman, or Labour's causing up to Muslim voters, and so on and so forth. So that's been gradually breaking down to where many of them have either voted for Boris Johnson, they've decided to stay at home, or they're now coming to reform. And so the core Labour vote is just disintegrating for Labour. But the problem they have is that the Islamic vote that they've also relied on and curried favour with, for the want of a better phrase, is also breaking down, isn't it? So Kate Learn, the Labour MP in Blackburn, lost the seat. Johnny Ashworth lost his seat, I think, in Leicester. Jess Phillips nearly lost the seat in Birmingham.
That would have been a terrible transformation.
Yeah, no, absolutely, yeah, no. It's one of the reasons I stayed up late that night. And so we can see that vote breaking down for them as well. And I do think it's interesting that whilst they're trying to shore up that vote and I think they've been captured to an extent by these elites within the Muslim community. They've been captured and sold this, but it's not going to save them. I don't think it's going to save them, because they can't do enough in terms of, those elites. They won't satisfy them unless they came out completely on the side of Palestine, or so on and so forth. Until they radically change their views, they won't satisfy them. So I think they're going to lose out in all of this ultimately. I mean, they've got 3 more years in government or whatever. Yeah, no. Well, I'd be amazed if Starmer lasts that long. I mean, he certainly won't fight the next general election. Whether he goes well before that, I think, is now debatable. That's my reading of it after spending over 35 years in politics.
I don't know if you're familiar with Professor Betts from King's College War Studies Department, who has prophesied that Britain will face an identity politics, sort of almost civil war situation, he feels, within the next couple of decades, because of the way in which society is now fragmenting into identity groups, and because of the sort of politics I think primarily the New Left have been pushing, but which the Conservatives in government went along with, didn't really do anything to try and reverse. As somebody who represented a very diverse town, I mean, do you think that is over dramatic, or do you think there could be a real serious schism within British society?
Yeah, I think that analysis is correct. I think we're on the cusp of real issues, and to illustrate it or to give examples, I mean, the riots that came on top of the Southport murders are a good example of that. The pro-Palestine marches in London are an illustration of that. So there's some real sectarianism developing. And what I think is interesting is that government generally has worked with the mainstream media to try and keep a lid on any civil unrest. And so they will have done that around Southport, and I think the mainstream media generally played along with that. And I suspect, to give a very up-to-date example, where we've seen this Afghan scandal, where Ben Wallace allowed thousands of Afghanis to come to Britain, and we spent £7 billion, or we are going to do, on it, and I think is a massive issue for the public. But I also think that the mainstream media will go along with the government to try and keep a lid on that. So I think the story will fizzle out quite quickly. It won't be investigated as it should be by the mainstream media. And the primary reason for that is because they know that the public will be absolutely furious about what's gone on. And it's those sorts of but the problem is for government and for the mainstream media is that it doesn't work like it used to. Not even in Tony Blair. In Tony Blair's day, they managed the media. But with social media, the public of all age groups almost get their news in lots of different ways. So it can't be contained and it can't be managed in the way that it used to be. Even in the 90s and early 2000s, it used to be managed much very differently to what it can be now. So whilst they'll try and manage it now, they will fail to manage it. And so I would expect civil unrest to flare up in various instances, very much mixed in with sectarianism, and the different communities that exist. So all these different groups that you were describing, I can imagine what the professor is saying actually happening.
Talking about sort of the attempt to control flows of information and the articulation of particular controversial views. Presumably, if this definition of Islamophobia had already been in place, Casey would have found it very difficult to have written her report on the grooming gangs, because she did articulate the view that men of South Asian origin were massively overrepresented in terms of the types of people who were operating on a gang-like basis to abuse young white girls. Presumably that would have been defined as Islamophobic.
It would have been harder she'd have had to be more careful about how she wrote the report, wouldn't she? There's no doubt about that. I have a lot of time for Louise Casey. She's just done this review for the government. But I've known her well over 20 years. I worked with her when she was doing some work for the Labour government on rough sleeping. And she's one of those she's a good civil servant in that she cuts right through all the nonsense and gets to the point. And she did that on rough sleeping. Labour I'm going back many years under the Blair government. She really helped dramatically reduce rough sleeping. The reason I'm telling you that is that I think she's a good civil servant and serves the country really well, and so we should take notice of what she has to say. When Rotherham, the grooming gangs in Rotherham was investigated, it probably would be about 2016. Again, she was brought in to examine the issue, and I met her and gave her evidence then. And most recently, she's been brought in by this government, so she works under any government. And what she's done there is really produce a report that I think surprised Starmer. He was hoping for a report that would mean he didn't have to have a national inquiry. Well, all credit to Louise Casey. She said there should be a national inquiry because this is the biggest, these are my words, not hers, this is the biggest criminal justice scandal of our time. You can't underestimate that. And in terms of managing flows of information, I think the media played a role in initially investigating it. Andrew Norfolk, God bless him, he passed away recently. he on the Times really shone a light in this, and the Times published stories around it, and then it really got picked up. But then after couple of years, it moved on, didn't it? The story moved on until Elon Musk raised it. And that got a lot of attention on the subject again, thankfully. And now we have the Louise Casey report that you mentioned. Would have been harder if we'd have had certain Islamophobia laws in place for her to say what she did. But nevertheless, she's got us where we were in a better place on that very issue. And I remember, I had the Rochdale grooming scandal, and that will be 2012. I've been an MP for 2 years. And I immediately came out and said, and I knew very little about the subject, but it was so obvious that the perpetrators were committing these crimes, and that their ethnicity, their religion were key factors in their culture, were key factors in why they were abusing these white girls. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And I said it at the time. I remember I was in my flat in London, and I was doing a Radio 5 interview, and he asked me whether religion was a factor, and I said it was. That went down very badly with senior members of the Labour Party.
Yeah, tell us about that, because that is fascinating to hear, that there were people within a particular party who were trying to suppress you and others from revealing something truly horrific.
Yeah, no, that's right. It did me no favours in terms of being a member of the Labour Party or being a Labour MP. But so I come out and say, race and ethnicity, religion are a key factor. And then, and it happened all of a sudden, as these things do in politics. And then the next thing is it's Prime Minister's questions. And I'm on the order paper to ask a question, which is helpful. And I'm going to ask it about the grooming, Rochdale grooming gangs. Who sidles up to me in the corridor a couple of hours before PMQ's Tony Lloyd MP. And he's the chair at that time. He's the chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party, which is like the union convener for Labour MPs. So if there's 200, 300, 400 Labour MPs, he's the head guy who represents them effectively. And he sidles up to me and says, "Simon, I don't, he says, I'm going to ask a question, because he was on the order paper by chance as well, and I'm going to ask it about the Rochdale grooming scandal." And he was giving me notice because he's going to talk about my constituency, so it's just polite to do that. He said, "But I don't think we should mention the ethnicity or religion of the perpetrators. It doesn't do us any good electorally." That's what he said to me. I said, "Well, you're entitled to your view, blah blah blah." And anyway, that was that. And the background to it is important, because what Tony was also doing, the reason he was asking the question on the grooming gangs at Prime Minister's questions isn't because he was concerned about it. It's because he was standing to be the police commissioner for Greater Manchester. And so he was showboating in advance of going for the election. And he would know that a good proportion of Muslim voters decide who the mayor, the police commissioner for Greater Manchester will be. And so he was tacking in that direction. And it's not just me saying that this is what he said to me in the corridors before PMQs. I mean, soon after that, he took part in a Westminster Hall debate and said something very similar, that he didn't believe race, religion, etc. were a factor in those crimes. And then the other person to say it to me was a guy called Jim Dobbin MP, who, big Catholic. He was the MP for Haywood and Middleton. And for those, I mean, people won't know this, Rochdale and Haywood and Middleton are coterminous with the local authority area. They were at the time. So Rochdale Council covers those two constituencies. So he was my neighbour. I'd been a Labour MP for many years, elder statesman in that respect. And he sidled up to me at some function within the borough and said, "Simon, you don't want to mention," yes, I won't try and do a Scottish voice like what he had, but he says, "You don't want to mention the race and stuff of these people committing these crimes. It doesn't do us any good in terms of votes, etc." But it's interestingly, he's the guy that had warned me off mentioning that Cyril Smith was a paedophile. So he had a bit of
He had a sort of a bit of history in this area himself.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of denial, yeah, absolutely. And I always found that quite peculiar, actually. Yeah.
So is it the Labour Party, do you think, has a lot to fear from this national inquiry? Because presumably virtually all the councils where this horrific stuff was going on were Labour controlled, whether you're talking about Oxford, Telford, Rochdale, Rotherham, you name it. Not many of these places were under the Conservatives or the Lib Dems. So it seems to me specifically the Labour Party that has something to fear about this.
Yeah, because I mean, it's electorally, it's relatively simple, isn't it? Because these communities have tended to vote Labour, so they have Labour local authorities. The Muslim communities have tended to vote Labour over the years, so they have Labour local authorities. Some people in those communities have a propensity to abuse white girls, so it happens in those in those communities. The interesting thing about Jim Dobbin as well is that all the perpetrators came from Rochdale, because I had the Muslim community, and all the victims came from Heywood and Middleton. Because he didn't have a very big Muslim community at all, but many of the Muslim perpetrators ran small businesses, takeaways, taxiing in his constituency, and were abusing. But he seemed to have less regard for he wanted a quiet life in politics, I think. But I always found it quite interesting that he represented the victims, I represented the perpetrators, and yet I was the one sticking up for the victims, and he was the one not prepared to criticise the perpetrators.
Did you find that within the Muslim community there were big differences of attitude towards what was happening? I mean, there must have been local Muslims who were horrified by what was going on and wanted to see, like non-Muslims, this stuff dealt with. Or did you find there was an almost a conformity of opinion and a desire for this to be swept under the carpet?
A diverse range of views in the Muslim community. Yeah, I remember a Muslim Labour activist, Labour Party member locally. He wrote to the Rochdale Observer, and the letter more or less said, "Listen, Danczuk, just remember who put you in Parliament. It's our community." He was sort of warning me off. He was saying I should shut up about it. And that's not very different from the message I received from Rochdale Council of Mosques. They were like, you should stop talking about this, and trying to apply pressure on me to do that. Luckily, I had better control of the local Labour Party, so there were fewer people in the local Labour Party that were saying that to me. There's still some that were saying, listen, move on to a different issue, campaign on business rates or something like that. Stop campaigning on this. So there was some of that in the local Labour Party, but I managed the local Labour Party very well, so that wasn't a particular issue. But nationally, I remember one of the whips describing me to my face as the nonce finder general. That's it, and that's not a compliment. It's really quite possibly. But that again, that's like ridicule to the point where why don't you just shut up and move on about it? But if you, perhaps some academics should do a study. You had Anne Cryer in West Yorkshire come out on these issues and was critical, and it effectively ended her career. I came out on these issues. I also called for resignations around Rotherham because I sat on the community's local government select committee that examined some of those issues, and I called for, I think Sean Wright was the Labour Police Commissioner to resign, which he ended up doing. I had South Yorkshire Labour MPs coming up to me and saying, stop doing this. So it's hardly surprising that I fell out of the Labour Party as well. Sarah Champion wrote a piece for the Sun newspaper.
The MP for Rotherham.
Yeah, about the grooming scandal in the Sun newspaper, and she lost a job under Corbyn in the shadow cabinet. I find it bizarre that so few politicians have actually campaigned on these issues. But when you look at it, perhaps there's a good reason that they don't.
I mean, the role of the left or the new left, I always make that distinction, has been truly appalling. I mean, you mentioned Anne Cryer, incredibly courageous Labour politician. The Guardian denounced her, I think, going back to 2005 when she started raising these issues, and they denounced her as being effectively a member of the BNP because Nick Griffin was standing against her that year, trying to capitalise on all this. And the Guardian said there were effectively two BNP candidates standing for election in Keighley. Well, that's an incredibly appalling thing to say. But then, I mean, more recently, Starmer, when he was trying to fight off the idea of a national inquiry, said, oh, the people who are supporting this, like Kemi Badenoch and Robert Jenrick, they are, they're supporting or they're in some way advancing the far-right agenda. I don't know if he now includes himself as a far-rightist, given he's reluctantly had to agree to it. But I mean, that's an extraordinary thing again to say when clearly there are loads of people such as yourself and then Cryo, clearly not neo-Nazis, who have been concerned about this issue.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And these labels that are used to try and dampen down any progress on the issue clearly don't work, and the wider public just don't buy into it, do they? Anne Cryer being right wing, or me being a Nazi or anything. I mean, people just don't buy into it. But I mean, on a broader point, Starmer used to try and paint Boris Johnson as being a far-right conservative. I mean, he's far more left-wing than me and many others. I mean, he's a very left-wing conservative prime minister, wasn't he?
There's any politics whatsoever.
But they're not far-right. Yeah. So it's not unusual, but you're exactly right. I mean, trying to portray anybody that raises these issues as far right. Well, it doesn't do the most important point is that it doesn't do justice for the victims, does it? Or the survivors of abuse. That's the real issue. And in terms of the Guardian, I exposed Cyril Smith as a paedophile in 2012.
Could you briefly explain who Cyril Smith was?
Yeah,
because
sure.
incredibly, there will be people watching this who haven't a clue who he was.
Yeah, so he was the MP for Rochdale from 72 to 92. So a very long period. He was a Liberal MP, and he had a career of abusing children, which became apparent. And I know this because I met many of his victims, and I subsequently wrote the book Smile for the Camera, The Double Life of Cyril Smith. And I named him as a paedophile in Parliament in 2012. And the Liberal Party were disgusted with me. It was outrageous because he'd passed away a year or two later and had great obituaries in all the national newspapers. But nevertheless, it was quite apparent many of his victims have come forward. It's been proven by a government inquiry since that he was an abuser of children. And I do think that set some of the tone for what went on in Rochdale. I think people in the Muslim community saw that, because it was very well known that he was an abuser. I mean, there's no doubt about that. People in the community, that's how I found out. I've been knocking on doors in Rochdale, and people say, you do know that the old MP abused kids.
Yeah, there were rumours about him, like Jimmy Savile, swirling around for years before.
Yeah, and he was friends.
People used to joke about.
Yeah, he was friends with Jimmy Savile. Yeah, that's right. But coming to the Guardian, so we write this book and it comes out in 2014, and it gets important reviews, positive reviews by all the national newspapers. It's the Sunday Times Political Book of the Year. The only negative review it got was in the Guardian. They have a peculiar approach to paedophilia, actually, and to politics. I think, for whatever reason, I think they seem to struggle with it. I don't know what that's about.
Well, I think, again, we might not have time to delve into that, sadly, but I think it is all connected to the New Left worldview, which results in them adopting positions that the vast majority of traditional Labour voters would consider very bizarre, as on transgenderism.
Well, yeah,
mentioned, and that's why they're now in trouble.
Yeah, and bringing that up to speed, I mean, you did have that connect the two stories, really. You had people like Harriet Harman and Patricia Ewart the Council for Civil Liberties, or whatever its precise name was, perhaps in the 70s or 80s, campaign allowing PI, which was a paedophile information exchange, to become a member of the organisation, and they were campaigning in favour of paedophilia, and this Council for Civil Liberties was sort of endorsing that. I mean, and that's a well-known,
Yeah, because I think these kind of middle-class sort of cultural Marxists hated the family, the concept of the family, and their whole agenda, which we now see in terms of the whole queering phenomenon, is about destroying, deconstructing what they consider to be normative British society. So it started a long time before it became actually kind of mainstream. Yeah. So, yeah. Which leads me to ask you what you think about the possibility of a breakaway left-wing party which brings together elements within the Muslim community, the Greens, and the sort of Corbynistas. I mean, they've split before they've even got a name or an email address. But nevertheless, it seems to me that this is going to actually happen, or some sort of coalition. Tell me what you think about its prospects.
Oh, I think it really has prospects. I fought the Rochdale by-election for reform in February 2024. And so I was fighting George Galloway. It's quite an extraordinary by-election. But the reason I mention that is that he's very good at organising, and so whilst he might not be part of that coalition of far left,
because he's too right wing on Zionism, so that was...
Yeah, exactly. But the point I make is that they will have a base of supporters, very much in the Muslim community, but not solely. People on the left who are unhappy with Starmer's approach to Labour politics. So they will have a core, they will have a base. And I think the initial opinion polling has shown that if that party existed, something like 15% will vote for the Corbyn party, 15% will vote for Starmer's party, 15% will vote, I don't know if these all add up, so we'll have to be careful, 15% vote for the Conservatives, and 30% will vote Reform. And the Greens and Liberals fall very much back. So good for Reform, certainly not good for Starmer. I think this could be a disaster for Starmer, because it returns us to where we started, really, which is that he's trying to shore up support in the Muslim community, and yet he's going to have a load of that stolen away from him by this new Corbynite Islamic party.
And they're also going to tuck into the sort of white middle class vote more, I suspect, in the south of England, southeast London, but maybe some sort of inner city areas of, places like Edinburgh and Manchester and Bristol, of course. So it could be a really fascinating next few years and next election. I mean, it seems we're almost moving into a sort of Weimar Germany type situation.
Yeah, things are breaking down, aren't they? I mean, from when I came into politics, things have just changed so radically. But society's changed radically, hasn't it? So we shouldn't be surprised by this. But it does feel, just throwing ideas around, it does feel that Starmer's Labour are trying to hold on to what's gone before. And that's just not going to cut it, And perhaps, Reform, to their credit, are much more nimble, much more agile in terms of appealing to the electorate. They're not the Conservatives or Labour. They're not part of this uni-party. But neither is Corbyn's new party. So it is really interesting where politics is going, actually. It's fascinating to watch. Frustrating as well, I have to say.
I mean, it's an amazing realignment, but in a way, one that makes sense, because it seems to me Reform are a popular front coalition of people who were formerly Conservative, formerly Labour, or none of the above, but who share the fundamental desire is to actually save Britain as a self-governing entity and as a broadly liberal democracy. That's what its unifying message is. Whereas the parties of the left, of which there are now about 5 or 6, if you include, Plaid Cymru and the Scottish Nationalists and Sinn Féin and what have you, all of these parties are really about this transition away from liberal democracy and national sovereignty. They're all about ultimately the destruction of this country and its political heritage. And so you're getting now a choice that the British people are going to have to face, which is essentially a political choice rather than the politics of the modern era, which were really about economics primarily. I don't know. Am I?
Yeah, well,
something. Or
yeah, I think you are, and that. I mean, going back to some of what you've been saying earlier, politics was very much based around class, wasn't it? But that's totally broken down. That's not there at all. And when we say class, we mean economics. But yeah, it's radically changed. What I think will be interesting is whether reform can really hold it together, not least against the institutions that support, that sort of Starmerist view of the world, because I think they will do all they can to try and stop reform. But I do think that there's a massive appetite out there amongst the public to hold on to what we've had and what we've got. And I think that will win out, but all's to be seen over the next 2, 3, 4 years. I mean, it's totally unpredictable.
It's going to be a very, very bumpy but fascinating ride. Lastly, Simon, I'd like to ask you, if you had a Trump-like executive order superpower, what is it you would do with that thing?
It very much relates to what we've been talking about. I would bring action against those who covered up the grooming scandal. The police, the senior police officers, the senior social workers that set the culture that denied justice for the victims, survivors of the rape gangs. So that's what I'd implement, and it would be in double quick time.
Sounds good to me. Simon, thank you so much. It's been fascinating talking to you.